The sky was a canvas of deep midnight blue, stars scattered like grains of salt across a dark velvet cloth. The towering pines stood as silent sentinels on either side of the narrow, winding road that cut through the heart of the forest. The only sound was the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a nocturnal breeze. Paul Jacobs, a salesman from the city, was on his way back from a business trip in the nearby town of Green Hollow. The road, shrouded in shadows and illuminated only by his headlights, seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Paul had taken this route before, always finding it quicker and more peaceful than the crowded highways, but tonight, an inexplicable sense of unease gnawed at him. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 11:43 p.m. The night was getting late, and he still had a few hours to go before reaching his home. He rolled down the window, hoping the fresh air would help keep him awake. The cool night air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, momentarily soothing his nerves. Just as he began to relax, he noticed a figure on the side of the road up ahead. A man, walking alone in the dark, illuminated briefly by the car's headlights before slipping back into shadow. Paul's first instinct was to keep driving. It was late and he was tired, but a sense of duty and humanity made him slow down. What if the man was in trouble? This stretch of road was desolate. The next town was miles away. Paul pulled over to the side of the road and rolled to a stop. The man approached the car, his face hidden under the brim of a wide, worn hat. Paul leaned over and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" Paul called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The man nodded, his face still obscured by shadows. He moved closer, and Paul unlocked the door. The stranger climbed in silently, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. The interior light revealed him briefly. He was tall, with a lean build, and wore a long, dark coat that looked out of place for the season. His face was pale, almost gaunt, with piercing eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dim light. "Thanks," the stranger said, his voice low and raspy. He didn't offer any other explanation. "No problem," Paul replied, forcing a smile. "Where are you headed?" The stranger turned his head slowly to look at Paul. "Just to the next town. Any drop-off point is fine." Paul nodded and put the car back in gear, merging onto the road once more. The tension in the car was palpable. Paul tried to make small talk to break the silence. "So, what were you doing out here so late?" he asked. The stranger didn't respond immediately. When he did, his answer was vague. "Just traveling, needed to get somewhere." Paul glanced at him out of the corner of his eye. The man's face was impassive, giving away nothing. Unnerved, Paul tried another approach. "My name's Paul, by the way." The man turned to look at him again, a slow, deliberate movement. "James," he said after a long pause. The silence settled back in, heavier than before. Paul's mind began to race. He remembered hearing something on the news a while back about a string of murders in the area. People had been found dead in the forest, their bodies mutilated. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced at James again, who was staring straight ahead, unblinking. As they drove deeper into the forest, Paul's unease grew. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The road was becoming rougher, the potholes and cracks jarring the car and its occupants. Paul tried to shake off his paranoia. He was letting his imagination run wild. The man was probably just a harmless traveler. Still, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Paul's eyes kept darting to the fuel gauge, the time, the rear-view mirror, anything to distract himself. He cleared his throat, deciding to try conversation one more time. "So, what do you do, James?" James turned his head slowly again, his eyes fixing on Paul with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I move around a lot, do odd jobs, whatever needs doing." Paul nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Sounds interesting. Must see a lot of different places." James didn't respond, just kept staring at him. Paul felt his heart rate quicken. The air in the car seemed to grow colder. He tried to focus on the road, but the oppressive silence and the stranger's unwavering gaze made it difficult. Suddenly, James broke the silence. "You know, a lot of people have gone missing in these woods." Paul's blood ran cold. He forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. I've heard about that. Creepy stuff." James leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you believe in monsters, Paul?" Paul's mouth went dry. He glanced at James, whose eyes seemed to gleam with a strange light. "Monsters?" he echoed weakly. "No, I don't believe in that sort of thing." James smiled, a slow, unsettling curve of his lips. "Maybe you should." The words hung in the air like a dark omen. Paul's mind raced. He needed to get to the next town and drop this guy off. The forest around them seemed to close in even more, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. As they rounded a bend, Paul saw something up ahead. A small, abandoned gas station, its sign barely visible in the gloom. Relief washed over him. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I think I'll stop here for a moment," Paul said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Need to stretch my legs." James didn't protest, just nodded slowly. Paul pulled into the parking lot, the car's headlights casting long shadows across the dilapidated building. He turned off the engine and got out. The cool night air hitting him like a splash of cold water. James followed, his movements slow and deliberate. Paul walked around to the front of the car, trying to calm his racing heart. He needed to think, to figure out what to do next. The small gas station was dark and deserted, its windows broken and the door hanging off its hinges. It didn't look like it had been used in years. Paul took a deep breath and turned to James. "I think I'll just check inside, see if there's a payphone or something. Might be able to call for help." James watched him, his expression unreadable. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low. Paul nodded and walked towards the gas station, his footsteps echoing in the still night. He could feel James's eyes on him, following his every move. He reached the door and pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the gas station was a mess. Dust and debris covered the floor, and the shelves were empty and broken. Paul scanned the room, his eyes landing on an old payphone on the wall. He walked over to it and picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. The line was dead. He put the receiver back and turned around, his heart pounding. James was standing in the doorway, watching him with that same unnerving intensity. "Phone's dead," Paul said, trying to sound casual. "Looks like we're on our own." James nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Paul. "Looks that way." Paul swallowed hard, his mind racing. He needed to get back to the car and get out of here. But as he moved towards the door, James stepped aside, letting him pass. Paul's heart was pounding in his chest as he walked back to the car, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. He got into the driver's seat and waited for James to get in beside him. Once they were both in the car, Paul started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The silence between them was thicker than ever, the tension almost unbearable. As they drove on, Paul's mind was a whirlwind of fear and suspicion. He couldn't shake the feeling that James was more than just a strange hitchhiker. There was something deeply wrong about him, something that made Paul's skin crawl. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Paul saw James move. He turned his head just in time to see James reach into his coat and pull out a long, wicked-looking knife. Paul's blood turned to ice. He swerved the car, trying to throw James off balance, but the stranger was quicker than he looked. James lunged at him, the knife glinting in the dim light. Paul fought back, his survival instincts kicking in. He grabbed James's arm, trying to wrestle the knife away, but James was strong, unnaturally strong. The car swerved wildly, careening off the road and crashing into the trees. The impact threw them both against the seats, the airbag deploying with a loud pop. Paul's head was ringing, his vision blurred, but he didn't have time to think. He shoved James away and scrambled out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran into the forest. the darkness swallowing him up. He could hear James behind him, moving through the trees with an eerie silence. Paul's mind was a blur of fear and desperation. He needed to find help, to get away from this nightmare. He stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching at his skin. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He could hear James's footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. Paul's breath came in ragged gasps as he ran, his mind racing. He needed to think, to come up with a plan. He couldn't keep running forever. He needed to find a way to stop James, to escape this nightmare. As he ran, he spotted a small, abandoned cabin in the distance. It was dark and run down, but it was better than nothing. He sprinted towards it, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the cabin and threw open the door, slamming it shut behind him. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. Paul could hear James outside, his footsteps growing louder. He looked around frantically, searching for something he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on an old, rusty axe propped up in the corner. He grabbed it, his hands shaking. The door creaked open, and James stepped inside, his eyes glinting in the darkness. Paul raised the axe, his heart pounding in his chest. James smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent shivers down Paul's spine. "You can't run forever, Paul," he said, his voice low and menacing. Paul didn't respond. He swung the axe, aiming for James's head, but the stranger was quicker than he looked. He dodged the blow and lunged at Paul, the knife flashing in the dim light. They struggled, the cabin echoing with the sounds of their fight. Paul's mind was a blur of fear and desperation. He needed to survive, to get away from this nightmare. With a burst of strength, he shoved James away and swung the axe again. This time it connected, the blade sinking into James's shoulder. The stranger let out a scream of pain and stumbled back, his eyes filled with rage. Paul didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned and ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the forest. He could hear James behind him, his footsteps growing fainter as he ran. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the forest, the trees giving way to open fields. He stumbled onto the road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In the distance he could see the lights of a town, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He ran towards it, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to find help, to get away from this nightmare. As he reached the town, he collapsed on the sidewalk, his body shaking with exhaustion. People gathered around him, their faces filled with concern. He tried to speak, to tell them about the horror he had just escaped, but his voice was gone. He could only lie there, his mind a whirl of fear and relief. The last thing he saw before he passed out was the concerned faces of the townspeople, their voices fading into the background. When he woke up, he was in a hospital bed, his body aching and his mind foggy. A nurse was standing beside him, her face kind and reassuring. "You're safe now," she said, her voice soothing. "You're going to be okay." Paul closed his eyes, a sense of relief washing over him. He had survived. He had escaped the nightmare, but deep down, he knew that the horror wasn't over. James was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. And Paul knew that he would never be able to forget the nightmare he had lived through, the fear that had gripped his heart, 'cause some nightmares never truly end.